Since you're making such an issue of sticking to the rules, we're perfectly willing to do just that.
It wasn't just a fish-out-of-water comedy. It was a surrealist masterpiece disguised as a sitcom, where the star hated his co-star. The pig was smarter than most actors, and the entire show was one producer's middle finger to rural America. Behind the talking animals and absurdist humor, Green Acres was chaos held together by spite and genius. These are 20 secrets about Green Acres hidden for decades. And the bonus? Arnold the Pig had a better contract than most of the human cast. Number 20. Eddie Albert despised Ava Gabor.
Story, I don't remember how it ended.
You don't remember? Wenn ich Sie sehe, sicher.
On screen, Oliver and Lisa Douglas were television's most charming mismatched couple, their loving banter and affectionate chemistry defining the show's heart. Off-screen, Eddie Albert couldn't stand Eva Gabor and made no effort to hide it. Albert was a serious actor who'd been nominated for an Academy Award, someone who approached every role with method, discipline, and professional intensity. Gabor was a Hungarian socialite who'd stumbled into acting, treated the show like a glamorous party, and seemed more interested in her wardrobe than her performance. Albert found her unprofessional, shallow, and frustrating to work with. She would show up late, forget lines repeatedly, stop scenes to check her makeup, and seemed completely unconcerned with the delays she caused. Between takes, Albert would retreat to his trailer, avoiding any interaction with Gabor beyond what was absolutely necessary. He never socialized with her, never joined cast gatherings if she was attending, and would visibly tense when they had scenes together. Gabor knew Albert disliked her and responded with deliberate antagonism, making even less effort to be professional, playing up her ditzy persona specifically to irritate him. The tension was so obvious that other cast members had to mediate, trying to keep the two stars from open conflict that would halt production entirely. What's remarkable is how completely this mutual hatred disappeared on camera, where their chemistry seemed effortless and genuine. Both were professional enough to perform affection they absolutely didn't feel, creating one of television's most beloved relationships while privately despising each other. Number 19. The show was deliberately surrealist. Green Acres wasn't accidentally weird. Producer Paul Henning intentionally created the most surrealist show network television had ever aired, pushing the boundaries of what sitcoms could be. While other rural comedies like the Beverly Hillbillies played their premises straight, Green Acres embraced pure absurdism. Characters would break the fourth wall, acknowledge they were in a television show, hear the background music that shouldn't exist, and exist in a world where basic logic didn't apply. Henning was influenced by European absurdist theater and wanted to bring that sensibility to American television, using the sitcom format as a Trojan horse for experimental comedy. He'd pitch these bizarre ideas in production meetings, things like having a pig that could write, a telephone pole that needed climbing to make calls, or characters who could pull down title cards from thin air. Network executives were baffled and horrified, arguing that viewers wanted straightforward comedy, not avant-garde experimentation. Henning insisted that treating absurdity seriously would be funnier than traditional jokes, and he was right. Green Acres developed a cult following specifically because it was so weird, so willing to abandon conventional sitcom logic in favor of pure surrealist comedy. Critics at the time were divided, some praising its innovation, while others dismissed it as nonsense. But Henning never compromised his vision, making Green Acres perhaps the strangest show to ever air on network television during prime time, a genuine work of absurdist art masquerading as lowbrow rural comedy. Number 18. Arnold the Pig had a team of 5 trainers.
I'm sorry, Mr. Douglas. Arnold is next.
What?
That's one thing I don't think kids work enough on in driving hogs is working on turn.
Arnold Ziffel, the pig who adopted Fred and Doris Ziffel, became one of television's biggest stars despite being, well, a pig. But making Arnold work on camera required an unprecedented effort. The production employed 5 full-time animal trainers working in shifts, because pigs are notoriously difficult to control and have extremely short attention spans. Each Arnold scene required hours of preparation and dozens of takes because the pig would only cooperate for brief periods before losing interest or becoming agitated. The trainers use food rewards, but pigs are smart enough to realize they'll get fed eventually, making them unreliable performers. Multiple backup pigs were kept on set at all times, each trained to perform specific tricks. So, if the primary Arnold refused to cooperate, they could substitute another pig that looked identical. Viewers never knew they were watching different pigs throughout an episode, sometimes even within a single scene. The Arnold pigs had their own climate-controlled trailer, custom diet, and medical team monitoring their health constantly. Their care cost more than most human actors' salaries, but the producers considered it essential because Arnold had become the show's breakout star. Eddie Albert resented that a pig got better treatment than the human cast, once sarcastically commenting that Arnold's trailer was nicer than his own. But audiences loved Arnold. His scenes consistently tested highest in viewer surveys, proving that sometimes a well-trained pig is worth more than a classically trained actor, at least as far as network television is concerned. Number 17, the show mocked its own network. Constantly Green Acres regularly included jokes and references that satirized CBS itself, and the network didn't realize it was being mocked until years later. Writer Jay Summers embedded subtle criticisms of network executives, their creative interference, and their contempt for rural audiences into scripts that network censors approved without understanding the subtext. References to the big city bosses who don't understand country folk were really about CBS executives. Jokes about outsiders trying to change Hooterville to suit their own preferences mirrored the network's attempts to control the show's creative direction. The entire premise of Oliver Douglas as a sophisticated outsider trying to impose his urban values on a rural community that functioned perfectly well without him was essentially Paul Henning's view of network executives trying to fix his show. Characters would occasionally mention the network, breaking the fourth wall to complain about decisions clearly meant to reference actual CBS notes and demands. One episode featured a storyline about a television executive visiting Hooterville and being portrayed as completely out of touch with reality, unable to understand why rural people didn't want his improvements. CBS executives watched that episode, laughed at the satire, and completely missed that they were the target. Years later, when former writers discussed these embedded jokes, some CBS executives claimed they'd been aware all along, but contemporary production notes proved they were oblivious. Green Acres got away with consistently mocking its own network because it did so cleverly enough that the network thought it was on their side. Number 16, Eva Gabor couldn't remember her lines. Eva Gabor's charm and accent were perfect for Lisa Douglas, but her inability to memorize dialogue created constant production problems. She would read scripts the night before filming, forget everything by morning, and spend entire shooting days reading lines off cue cards held just off camera. Watch Green Acres closely, and you can often see Gabor's eyes moving, following the cue cards as she reads dialogue that should have been memorized. The production eventually gave up, trying to get her to learn lines properly, and instead invested in better cue card systems and strategic camera angles that hit her reading. This wasn't mild difficulty with memorization. It was profound inability or unwillingness to do the basic work of learning her part. Some cast members suspected Gabor was simply lazy, refusing to put in effort she considered beneath her. Others thought she genuinely struggled with memorization, that English wasn't her first language, and learning dialogue was harder for her than for native speakers. Either way, the result was the same: production delays, frustrated co-stars, and a lead actress who was essentially reading her performance off cards. Eddie Albert was particularly infuriated because his method acting approach required knowing his lines cold and being able to react naturally to his scene partner. Instead, he had to carefully time his delivery to match Gabor's reading speed, waiting for her eyes to find the next line on the card before he could respond. The spontaneity he valued was impossible when working opposite someone literally reading their dialogue. Number 15. The show was canceled because of demographics. Green Acres was still pulling strong ratings when CBS canceled it in 1971. a decision that baffled fans and enraged the cast. The show wasn't failing, it was being executed as part of what became known as the Rural Purge. Network executive Fred Silverman decided that CBS needed to attract younger, urban viewers that advertisers valued more than the older, rural audiences watching shows like Green Acres. M demographics trumped raw ratings, with CBS canceling multiple successful shows because they attracted the wrong kind of viewers. Green Acres drew huge audiences in rural markets and among older viewers, but advertisers wanted 18 to 49-year-olds in urban areas, demographics the show couldn't deliver. So, despite consistently ranking in the top 20, despite generating profits, despite being cheaper to produce than most alternatives, Green Acres was canceled because its audience wasn't fashionable enough for advertisers. The cast was devastated, particularly Eddie Albert, who'd made peace with doing a rural sitcom and suddenly found himself unemployed despite starring in a hit show. The cancellation represented a fundamental shift in how television success was measured, from pure viewership numbers to demographic targeting that valued quality of audience over quantity. Rural viewers who'd loyally watched CBS for decades suddenly didn't matter because they weren't buying the right products or living in the right places. Green Acres became a casualty of this new calculus. A successful show killed not because it failed, but because it succeeded with people the network and advertisers no longer cared about reaching. Number 14. The crossover episodes were contractual obligations. Green Acres existed in a shared universe with Petticoat Junction and the Beverly Hillbillies, with characters regularly crossing between shows. These weren't creative decisions, but contractual obligations imposed by CBS to create artificial connections between their rural sitcoms. The network believed that viewers who watched one show would be more likely to watch the others if they shared characters and settings, essentially using crossovers as free advertising. Paul Henning hated this approach, feeling it compromised each show's individual identity and forced storylines that didn't organically emerge from the characters. He particularly resented when CBS would demand that Beverly Hillbillies characters appear on Green Acres, bringing broad hillbilly comedy into his surrealist world where it didn't fit. The tonal clash was obvious to anyone paying attention, but CBS didn't care as long as the rating strategy worked. Writers had to create contrived reasons for these crossovers, spending time on network-mandated connections rather than developing their own characters and stories. Some crossovers worked well, particularly those between Green Acres and Petticoat Junction, which shared similar sensibilities. Others felt forced and awkward, disrupting narrative flow to service corporate strategy. Eddie Albert despised the crossover episodes, viewing them as artistic compromise for commercial gain. He'd complain in production meetings that he signed up to do Green Acres, not to be an extended advertisement for other shows. But his complaints were ignored because the crossover strategy was non-negotiable, decided at levels far above any actor or producer's authority to challenge or refuse. Number 13. The theme song was sung live every week. Unlike most sitcoms that recorded their theme songs once and used the same version for every episode, Green Acres' theme was performed live by Eddie Albert and Eva Gabor at the start of each week's filming. This wasn't an artistic choice, but a practical solution to a problem. Gabor's accent made her dialogue unpredictable, sometimes thick and sometimes barely noticeable, depending on her mood, tiredness, or level of preparation. The producers discovered early that her recorded theme song vocals didn't match how she sounded in that week's episode, creating jarring inconsistency. The solution was to record the theme song fresh each week, capturing Gabor's accent as it would sound in that specific episode. This meant that the Green Acres theme varies slightly across episodes, with subtle differences in timing, vocal quality, and accent thickness that most viewers never noticed, but that obsessive fans have cataloged extensively. Eddie Albert hated this requirement because it added unnecessary work to his schedule, another example of accommodating Gabor's unprofessionalism. But it solved the continuity problem and actually added charm, making each episode feel slightly unique. The theme song performances became a weekly ritual, one of the few times Albert and Gabor had to work together outside of scenes, standing side by side at microphones singing about city versus country life, while barely concealing their mutual dislike. The irony of them singing about partnership and companionship while personally despising each other, wasn't lost on anyone who witnessed these recording sessions. Number 12, Tom Lester was actually a farmer.
Now, would you describe them, please? Yes, sir. They were about bling, bling.
Tom Lester, who played farmhand Eb Dawson, wasn't acting. He was an actual farmer from Mississippi who'd never had professional acting training and approached the role by essentially being himself. Lester grew up on a farm, understood rural life intimately, and brought authentic knowledge of farming that no trained actor could fake. His casting was accidental, discovered during an open call where he auditioned on a whim while visiting Los Angeles. Producers were immediately struck by his genuineness, the way he naturally embodied rural sensibilities without condescension or caricature. While other actors were playing at being country, Lester simply was country, and the difference was obvious on screen. His performance style confused Eddie Albert, who expected method training and actor technique, but instead encountered someone who just showed up and existed as the character without any apparent process. Lester's approach seemed lazy or unprofessional to Albert until he realized that Lester's naturalness couldn't be taught or replicated. It was simply who he was. The authenticity made Eb one of the show's most beloved characters, a real country person surrounded by actors playing country people. Lester's lack of training sometimes created challenges. He struggled with hitting marks, understanding camera angles, and taking direction in technical ways that trained actors grasped instinctively. But his genuine rural knowledge brought legitimacy to Green Acres that elevated the entire show. When Eb talked about farming, you believed him because Lester actually knew what he was talking about, unlike everyone else who was faking their agricultural knowledge. Number 11. The show's sets were constantly falling apart.
Ain't nobody gonna pay no attention to what's going on as long as they got their names up there.
Green Acres was produced on a tight budget that couldn't afford elaborate or durable sets. The Hooterville locations were built cheap and maintained poorly, resulting in constant structural problems that sometimes made it into aired episodes. The Douglas farmhouse facade was particularly problematic, with walls that wobbled when doors opened, windows that wouldn't stay closed, and a porch that creaked ominously under actors' weight. Inside sets were slightly better, but still suffered from cheap construction that couldn't withstand the wear of constant filming. Paint would chip, wallpaper would peel, furniture would break at inconvenient moments, forcing production to stop while repairs were hastily completed. The town square set, used for multiple outdoor scenes, had buildings that were literally falling down, requiring crew members to prop them up between takes. In some episodes, you can see visible patches where walls were quickly repaired or painted over damage that occurred during filming. The deteriorating sets actually added to the show's surreal atmosphere, making Hooterville feel like a place where reality itself was slightly unstable and unreliable. But for the actors, particularly Eddie Albert, who took the work seriously, the falling apart sets were embarrassing reminders of the show's low budget and low prestige. He'd worked on major films with elaborate production values and resented performing on sets that looked like they might collapse at any moment. The crew did their best with limited resources, but there was only so much that could be done when the fundamental construction was inadequate and there was no money to rebuild properly. Number 10. Pat Buttram's accent was completely fake.
Your outfit, the transcontinental refrigerated.
Pat Buttram, who played Mr. Haney with his distinctive gravelly voice and thick rural accent, wasn't from the deep South or even from farm country. He was born in Alabama, but raised mostly in urban areas and had worked for years in radio where he had developed a standard broadcaster's accent with no regional characteristics. The exaggerated country drawl he used on Green Acres was a complete fabrication, a character voice he'd created decades earlier while working on the Gene Autry radio show, and had been using ever since because it got him work. Off camera, Buttram spoke in a completely different voice, clear and accent-free, shocking new cast members and crew who expected him to sound like Haney all the time. Eddie Albert was particularly annoyed when he discovered this, viewing it as more evidence that Green Acres was surrounded by phoniness and people who weren't taking the work seriously. But Buttram's fake accent was actually a demonstration of serious craft, a character choice he maintained so consistently that most people assumed it was real. The voice was so distinctive and memorable that it became impossible for Buttram to get work playing anything other than rural characters. effectively typecasting him based on an accent he'd invented. Years later, Buttram admitted that creating the Haney voice was both his greatest professional asset and biggest limitation, opening doors to constant work, while closing doors to roles that require different vocal qualities. He'd trapped himself in a character voice so successful that audiences and casting directors couldn't imagine him sounding any other way, even though his natural speaking voice was completely different. Number 9. The writers were mostly comedy legends in disguise. Greenacre's writing staff included people who would become some of the most successful comedy writers in television history. But they were working under pseudonyms because they were embarrassed to be associated with a rural sitcom. Several writers who'd later create or write for prestigious shows like MASH, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and The Bob Newhart Show started their careers anonymously writing Greenacre's episodes, viewing it as beneath their talents but necessary to break into the industry. They'd submit scripts under fake names, collect their paychecks, and never mention this work when discussing their careers with journalists or in later interviews. Only years later, after these writers had established reputations, did industry insiders reveal that some of Greenacre's best episodes had been written by people who'd deliberately hidden their involvement. Paul Henning knew about the pseudonyms and didn't care, as long as the scripts were good. But he was amused by the irony that writers viewed Greenacres as embarrassing hack work, while audiences and critics were starting to recognize it as genuinely innovative comedy. The embarrassed writers were too worried about prestige to realize they were contributing to something special, something that pushed boundaries in ways their later, respectable work often didn't. When Greenacres developed cult status in the 70s and 80s, some of these writers reluctantly acknowledged their involvement, claiming they'd always known the show was ahead of its time. But production records and personal letters reveal they genuinely looked down on the work while they were doing it, considering it a stepping stone to better things rather than valuable in itself. Number 8. CBS tried to make the show more realistic. By season 3, CBS executives were uncomfortable with Greenacres' surrealism and demanded that the show become more grounded and realistic like other rural sitcoms. They wanted fewer fourth wall breaks, less absurdist humor, more conventional storylines about farming and small-town life. Network notes insisted that talking pigs and characters hearing theme music were too weird, that viewers wanted relatable family comedy, not experimental theater. Paul Henning fought back furiously, arguing that Greenacre's weirdness was its identity, that making it more realistic would destroy what made it special. The battle escalated to the point where Henning threatened to quit, telling CBS they could find someone else to make their boring conventional sitcom. The network backed down partially, allowing Henning to keep some surrealist elements while demanding he tone down the most experimental aspects. The compromise resulted in season 3 being noticeably different from earlier seasons, slightly more grounded, with fewer reality-breaking moments and more emphasis on farming storylines. Henning hated the changes and deliberately sabotaged them by making the realistic farming stories as absurd as possible within the constraints CBS had imposed. He couldn't have Oliver literally hear the theme music anymore, so instead, he'd have Oliver engage in farming activities so ridiculous they were essentially surrealism, disguised as realism. The network thought they'd won, that they'd successfully normalized Greenacres. But Henning had simply found new ways to be weird that CBS was too unsophisticated to recognize as weird. Number 7. Ava Gabor's costumes. Cost more than entire episodes, Ava Gabor insisted on wearing designer gowns and expensive jewelry in every episode, regardless of whether it made sense for her character to be dressed formally while feeding chickens or working in a garden. Her wardrobe budget was astronomical, exceeding what was spent on sets, props, and other actors' costumes combined. CBS complained constantly that Gabor's clothing expenses were unsustainable, that no sitcom actress needed multiple designer gowns per episode. But Gabor had contractual approval over her wardrobe and refused to wear anything she considered beneath her standards. She viewed every episode as a fashion showcase, and herself as representing glamour and sophistication to viewers who otherwise had no exposure to high fashion. The irony, of course, was that the entire point of Lisa Douglas was that she was absurdly overdressed for farm life, that her inappropriate glamour was part of the comedy. Gabor took this too far, wearing clothes so expensive and elaborate that the jokes stopped being funny and became genuinely wasteful. Production designers sometimes had to redesign entire scenes around Gabor's wardrobe choices because her massive gowns wouldn't fit through doorways or sit properly in vehicles. Eddie Albert resented that Gabor's clothing budget exceeded his salary, that money was being wasted on vanity while other production areas suffered from inadequate funding. But CBS couldn't force her to change because she had too much contractual power, and knew that her glamour was part of what attracted viewers. The network was trapped supporting her expensive taste, while resenting every dollar spent on gowns that appeared once then were discarded. Number 6. The show predicted modern absurdist comedy. Green Acres was decades ahead of its time, using techniques and approaches that wouldn't become mainstream in comedy until the rise of shows like Arrested Development and Community. The self-aware fourth wall breaking, the acknowledgement of sitcom conventions while simultaneously following them, the surrealist approach to everyday situations, all of this was revolutionary for 1960s television. Critics at the time mostly didn't understand what Green Acres was doing, viewing it as silly rather than sophisticated. But comedy writers and performers recognized something special, that Henning was creating genuinely experimental comedy within the constraints of network sitcom format. Years later, when absurdist comedy became fashionable, Green Acres was rediscovered by a new generation who saw it as a precursor to the comedy they loved. Shows like 30 Rock and The Office used similar techniques of acknowledging their own artificiality while remaining emotionally grounded. Exactly what Green Acres had been doing since 1965. Modern comedy writers cite Green Acres as an influence, though many admit they discovered it after developing their own style, and were shocked to find that a rural 60s sitcom had already explored the territory they thought they were pioneering. Paul Henning never lived to see this critical reassessment, dying before Green Acres' reputation evolved from dated curiosity to acknowledged innovator. But the show's influence is unmistakable once you understand what to look for, how it established templates and techniques that comedy would spend decades rediscovering and claiming as innovations, when they were actually revivals of what Green Acres had accomplished first. Number 5. Oliver Douglas. Was based on Paul Henning himself.
They got into those packages by mistake.
No.
Eddie Albert's character wasn't a generic fish-out-of-water city lawyer. Oliver Douglas was deliberately modeled on Paul Henning's own experience of moving from New York to rural Missouri and struggling to adapt to country life. Henning had grown up in Missouri, moved to New York for his career, then returned to Missouri later in life, expecting to easily readjust to rural living. Instead, he found himself constantly frustrated, unable to understand why things worked differently, why his city expectations didn't translate, why locals seemed to deliberately make everything more complicated than necessary. Every Oliver Douglas storyline about trying to modernize Hooterville or impose efficiency on chaotic rural systems was based on Henning's real experiences and real failures. The show was therapeutic for Henning, allowing him to laugh at himself and his failed attempts to improve country life that didn't want or need improvement. But Oliver was also a critique of Henning's own arrogance, showing how urban sophistication could be a form of foolishness, how education didn't necessarily mean wisdom. Henning was making himself the fool, acknowledging through Oliver that maybe the country people who seemed backwards actually understood things he didn't. Eddie Albert never knew he was essentially playing the show's creator, that Oliver's frustrations were Henning's frustrations channeled through a fictional character. If he had known, it might have helped him understand the show better, might have given him more sympathy for what Henning was trying to accomplish. But Henning kept this connection private, letting audiences and even his own cast assume Oliver was purely fictional. Number 4. The show was nearly canceled.
Haney got rid of his farm.
Finally gave up.
After one season, despite what seemed like instant success, Green Acres almost didn't get renewed after its first season. And CBS was uncomfortable with the show's strangeness and poor critical reception from television reviewers who called it lowbrow garbage. The network had expected Green Acres to be another Beverly Hillbillies, straightforward fish-out-of-water comedy that everyone could understand. Instead, they got something weird and polarizing that confused as many viewers as it entertained. Internal CBS documents show serious discussions about canceling Green Acres and replacing it with a more conventional rural sitcom that wouldn't generate confused viewer letters. What saved the show was its ratings in rural markets, where it performed spectacularly well despite confusing urban viewers. CBS's business model at the time still prioritized raw viewership numbers over demographics, meaning that rural viewers counted just as much as urban ones. Green Acres was pulling huge audiences in small towns and farming communities, demographics that advertisers wanted to reach with agricultural and household products. The network reluctantly renewed the show, viewing it as a calculated risk that might still fail, but had demonstrated enough audience to deserve another chance. Paul Henning knew how close they'd come to cancellation and used it as leverage, arguing that if CBS wanted to keep the show, they needed to stop interfering creatively. The network agreed, giving Henning more freedom in Season 2 than he'd had in Season 1. The near cancellation actually strengthened Green Acres by forcing CBS to accept the show's weirdness, rather than constantly trying to normalize it into something safer and less interesting. Number 3. Arnold the Pig was nearly killed by heat stroke. During filming of a summer episode in the show's 3rd season, one of the Arnold pigs collapsed from heat stroke and nearly died, exposing the dangerous conditions animal actors endured. The production was filming outdoors in the San Fernando Valley, where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. And pigs, unlike humans, can't sweat to regulate body temperature. The pig had been working for hours in direct sunlight, wearing the various props and costumes Arnold's scenes required, when it suddenly collapsed mid-scene. The trainers immediately recognized heat stroke and rushed the pig to a veterinary hospital where it spent 3 days recovering. The incident could have killed the pig and should have resulted in improved safety protocols, but instead, the production simply became more careful about using backup pigs and limiting each pig's time in hot conditions. Animal welfare wasn't the priority that production efficiency was, and while no one wanted animals to die, they also weren't willing to significantly alter filming schedules or techniques to ensure animal safety. The Humane Society investigated after receiving anonymous complaints from crew members, but their authority was limited, and the changes they mandated were minimal. Arnold continued appearing in outdoor summer scenes, just with more frequent breaks and water available, but still working in conditions that were fundamentally unsafe for pigs. Eddie Albert, who loved animals, was horrified by the incident and argued that the show should stop using live pigs or at least stop filming them in extreme weather. But he was overruled because Arnold's popularity was too valuable to sacrifice for animal welfare concerns that most people in the production didn't take seriously. Number 2, the final episode, wasn't supposed to be the final episode.
He said, you're going to drug us with me, you better get dressed because martinis for breakfast?
When Green Acres aired its last episode on April 27, 1971, nobody involved with the show knew it was the finale. They were planning Season 7, had story ideas developed, and expected to return after the summer hiatus. The cancellation announcement came weeks after filming had wrapped, giving the cast and crew no opportunity to create a proper series finale or say goodbye to characters they had lived with for 6 years. The episode that became the last was a completely ordinary installment with no conclusion, no resolution, nothing that suggested finality. It simply ended mid-storyline like any other episode, then never came back. Eddie Albert was furious about the disrespect, that CBS hadn't even given them warning or the courtesy of filming a proper conclusion. Ava Gabor, ironically, was relieved because she was tired of the show and ready to move on. But even she admitted the abrupt ending was unprofessional. The cast learned about cancellation from Variety like everyone else. No phone calls from the network, no meetings, just a trade publication announcing that Green Acres was done. Decades later, when DVD collections created demand for closure, surviving cast members recorded new material attempting to provide the ending the show never got. but it couldn't recapture what was lost. The opportunity to properly conclude a show that had run for 6 seasons and deserved better than an accidental finale. The abrupt cancellation became a symbol of how the rural purge was handled, with CBS showing no respect for shows or audiences they had decided to discard in pursuit of different demographics. Number 1. Eddie Albert refused to do reunion movies.
The Brown Derby were the principals, Eva Gabor and Eddie Albert, or if you prefer, Lisa.
In the decades after Green Acres ended, there were multiple attempts to create reunion movies or revival series, and every single time, Eddie Albert refused to participate, effectively killing the projects before they could begin. CBS offered substantial money, producers promised creative control, former cast members begged him to reconsider, but Albert wouldn't budge. His reasons were complex and evolved over time. Initially, he claimed that Green Acres' story was complete and that reunion projects were cynical cash grabs with no artistic merit. Later, he admitted that he'd never liked the show, had only done it for money, and had no desire to revisit a period of his career he wasn't proud of. He'd been a serious actor who'd compromised his principles for a steady paycheck, and doing a reunion would be doubling down on that compromise. Most significantly, he refused to work with Eva Gabor again. Their mutual dislike had only intensified over the years, and the idea of spending months filming with her was intolerable. Gabor publicly said she'd love to reunite the cast, knowing Albert would refuse, making herself look gracious while he looked difficult and unreasonable. The dynamic frustrated other cast members who wanted reunion opportunities but couldn't proceed without both leads. Pat Buttram, Tom Lester, and others needed the work and resented Albert for letting personal feelings destroy everyone's opportunities. But Albert never wavered, turning down increasingly large offers up until his death in 2005. His refusal meant that Green Acres never got the reunion treatment that other classic sitcoms received, preserving its original run, but also leaving fans without closure or continuation. It was a final act of control from an actor who'd spent 6 years feeling controlled by a show he'd never wanted to do. Bonus fact: Arnold the Pig had a better contract than most human cast members. Arnold Zaffo's contract included provisions that no human actor on Green Acres enjoyed, negotiated by trainers who understood the pig's value and leverage. Arnold was guaranteed climate-controlled transportation in a custom trailer larger than what supporting cast members received. He had mandated rest periods every 30 minutes, strict limits on working hours that were shorter than what SAG rules required for human actors, and approval rights over any scenes involving water, fire, or other potentially stressful elements. Most remarkably, Arnold's contract included a clause that if the pig showed signs of distress or refused to perform, filming had to stop immediately with no penalties or pressure to continue. A protection human actors couldn't demand without being labeled difficult. The pigs playing Arnold were also paid per appearance, with their collective earnings exceeding what several supporting human cast members made per episode. Insurance requirements meant the production had to maintain multiple backup pigs at all times, essentially paying for 5 pigs, though only one appeared on screen. The trainers negotiated escalating fees as Arnold became more popular, eventually commanding rates that made the pig one of the show's highest paid performers. Tom Lester joked bitterly that he should have been born a pig since Arnold got better treatment, better pay, and more respect than the human actors who actually carried storylines. The pig's contract became legendary in Hollywood as an example of how non-human performers could sometimes negotiate better terms than people, simply because they were irreplaceable and everyone knew it.